This week on Agents of Health, payer AI is denying faster, provider AI is appealing faster, and somewhere in that loop, patients are waiting longer and the bill is getting bigger. My guest is Natalie Janssen, HealthTech Market Analyst and Business Strategist at the Market Signal, and she thinks the "just collaborate better" answer is dangerously naive. Stay with us. Welcome to Agents of Health. I'm Dr. Wellis, and the one thing that changed this week, the thing I cannot stop thinking about, is a detail buried in a MedCity news piece from July 20th, 2026. A health system executive named Ashish Barad used the phrase bot versus bot to describe what is now happening between payers and providers in prior authorization. Not as a future concern, as a present reality. And when I read that, I thought, okay, we need to talk about this today. My guest is Natalie Janssen. She's a HealthTech Market Analyst and Business Strategist at the Market Signal, and she covers the structural and commercial logic underneath these kinds of dynamics. Natalie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. And yes, bot versus bot is exactly the right frame. I'd argue it's been the right frame for about 18 months, and most people are only now catching up to it.
Let's start with the basics for anyone who hasn't been living inside this story. What actually happened, and what is the plain language version of what's going on right now?
So the short version is this. Payers, your large commercial insurers, your Medicare Advantage plans, have been deploying AI-driven utilization management tools for a few years now. The pitch was efficiency, faster decisions, more consistent criteria application, lower administrative overhead. What it actually produced, in a lot of cases, was a higher volume of automated denials. And some of those denials were flagged as clinically inappropriate. There was congressional scrutiny, there were lawsuits, the whole thing.
Right, the NH Predict situation, the Cigna algorithm controversy, those weren't hypothetical.
Exactly. So providers saw the denial rates climbing, and they started building or buying their own AI tools. Prior auth automation, appeal generation, real-time eligibility checking, predictive denial modeling. And now you have a situation where a payer's AI issues a denial, a provider's AI generates an appeal, the payer's AI reviews the appeal, and so on. The humans are increasingly at the edges of that loop, not the center.
And the cost of running that loop, who's actually paying for it?
Providers are paying for their automation stack. Payers are paying for theirs. And patients are paying in delayed care and in the administrative cost that gets baked into system pricing over time. Nobody in the middle of that loop is getting faster access to a medically necessary service. They're just getting a faster argument.
Okay, but I want to push on the faster part. Because one thing I hear from vendors is that automation actually speeds up the easy cases, the straightforward approvals, and only the genuinely contested cases end up in the loop you're describing. Is that not happening?
It's happening at the margins. And vendors are right that clean, well-documented requests move faster through automated systems than they did through manual queues. But the problem is that the definition of clean is set by the payer's criteria engine. So what looks like an efficiency gain on approval speed is sometimes just the payer's AI getting better at identifying which requests to wave through versus which ones to flag for denial. The approval rate on the easy cases goes up. The denial rate on anything ambiguous goes up too. And ambiguous is a category the payer's AI gets to define.
So the speed improvement is real, but it's unevenly distributed in a way that benefits the payer.
That's a fair way to put it. The cases that are fast because they're profitable to approve quickly. The cases that are slow because delay or denial is profitable.
Okay, let's pull on the clinical thread here, because that's where I live. When I think about prior authorization as a physician, even as a former practicing physician, the original intent was utilization management. Catch things that are genuinely inappropriate. Does any of this AI-driven back and forth actually serve that clinical purpose anymore?
I'd push back on the premise a little. I'm not sure prior authorization ever reliably served that clinical purpose at scale. There's a reasonable argument that it was always as much about cash flow management for payers as it was about clinical appropriateness.
That's a strong claim. I mean, there are genuinely inappropriate utilizations. There are procedures ordered that don't have evidence behind them.
Sure, but if your denial engine is running at the speed and volume that some of these AI systems are running, we're talking about systems that can process thousands of authorization requests per hour. The idea that each one is receiving meaningful clinical review is not credible. What you're getting is pattern matching against a criteria set, and the criteria set is set by the payer.
So, from a clinical standpoint, what does the delay actually look like on the ground? Because I want listeners who are running health systems to understand this isn't abstract.
Think about a patient who needs an MRI for a new neurological symptom. Under a well-functioning system, that authorization might come back in 24 to 48 hours, though I'd note the actual timeline varies a lot by payer and market. Under an automated denial and appeal cycle, you might be looking at 2-3 weeks before a human physician reviewer actually looks at the clinical record. And in that window, you've got a patient who is anxious, a provider who is doing administrative work instead of clinical work, and a health system that is eating the cost of that administrative labor.
And if it's something like a cancer staging scan, that delay has real downstream consequences.
Real consequences and real liability, which is part of why providers are investing in counter-automation. They can't just absorb the delay.
Right, and that's the trap. Because the moment you invest in counter-automation, you've validated the arms race.
You've done more than validated it. You've funded the next round of it.
Let me stay on the clinical lens for one more minute, because there's something I want to flag that I think gets lost. When we talk about AI-driven denials, we tend to talk about the denials that get appealed and overturned. But what about the denials that don't get appealed? Because that's where the real clinical harm is hiding.
That is the right question. And the data on appeal rates is incomplete, but what we know is that a significant portion of denied claims are never appealed. Patients don't know they can appeal. Providers don't have the bandwidth to appeal everything. So the AI denial engine has a structural advantage. It knows that a percentage of its denials will stick simply because the other side won't fight back. That's not a clinical filter. That's a revenue strategy.
And I want to be clear. I'm not saying every denial is inappropriate. There are legitimate denials. But the system is now calibrated in a way where the error rate on the denial side is partially subsidized by the appeal gap on the provider side.
Correct. And the AI appeal tools are trying to close that gap, which is why payers are now investing in smarter denial engines. It's a loop.
Here's what I keep coming back to, though. When I was practicing, the prior auth process, even the manual version, had a human on the other end who you could call, who you could argue with, who had some accountability for the decision. What happens to that accountability when it's AI all the way down?
It diffuses, and that's not accidental. When a denial comes from an algorithm, it's very hard to assign responsibility. The payer says the algorithm applied the criteria correctly. The criteria were set by a clinical committee. The clinical committee says they were following evidence-based guidelines, and the patient is still waiting for their MRI. Nobody is accountable because everybody followed the process.
That's actually a governance problem as much as a technology problem.
It's both. And it's one of the reasons I'm skeptical of the just make the AI more transparent argument. Transparency about how the algorithm works doesn't automatically create accountability for what the algorithm produces. Those are different things.
I want to push back on that slightly because I think transparency is at least a precondition for accountability. You can't hold anyone responsible for outcomes you can't see.
Fair. Transparency is necessary. I'm saying it's not sufficient. And a lot of the policy conversation right now is treating transparency as if it's the destination rather than the starting point. We get algorithm disclosure requirements, and then we declare victory. And the denial rates don't change.
Okay, let's get into the implementation reality here, because I think this is where health system leaders are really sitting right now. If you're a CFO or a CIO and you're listening to this, your denial rate has probably gone up over the last 2 years. You're being pitched prior auth AI tools. What does the actual decision look like, and what are the traps?
The first trap is framing the investment as a clinical improvement. It's not. It's a defensive cost. You're not buying an AI tool because it's going to improve patient outcomes. You're buying it because if you don't, your approval rates drop and your revenue drops. That's a fundamentally different business case, and leaders need to be honest with themselves about that distinction.
I'd push back slightly there, because some of these tools do have a clinical workflow component. Real-time clinical decision support, documentation assistance at the point of order. That's not purely defensive.
Some of them do, but when you're buying a prior auth AI tool in response to an escalating denial rate, you are not primarily buying clinical decision support. You're buying a counter denial engine. And if your vendor is pitching it as a clinical improvement tool, that's a marketing frame, not a functional description.
Okay, but let's say a health system does buy one of these tools. What does the implementation actually look like? What breaks first?
Integration is the first wall you hit. These tools need to connect to your EHR, your payer portals, your coding systems, and they need to do it in near real time. If you're running Epic, you have a better chance. If you're running a fragmented system with multiple EHR instances, which a lot of mid-sized regional health systems are, the integration cost alone can eat your projected ROI in the first 18 months.
And the payer side is not exactly making this easy.
The payer side has every incentive to make their portals just difficult enough that automation is hard. Not impossible. Impossible would attract regulatory attention. Just difficult. Enough friction that the ROI on provider-side automation is lower than it should be.
Is that intentional, or is it just legacy infrastructure?
It's both, and the effect is the same.
That's a really important point. Because when we talk to vendors in this space, and I've talked to several, they tend to frame payer portal friction as a technical problem that their API can solve. And you're saying the friction is partly structural and intentional.
I'm saying you should ask who benefits from the friction persisting. And the answer is the payer benefits every time a provider gives up on an appeal because the portal is too slow or the documentation requirement is too onerous. That's not a bug in their system.
What about the staffing reality on the provider side? Because I think there's a piece of this that doesn't get enough attention. You can buy the tool, but somebody has to manage it, train it, audit it. That's not free.
It's absolutely not free, and it's one of the things vendors dramatically understate in their pitch. The tool needs a dedicated owner, someone who understands both the clinical logic and the payer criteria well enough to tune the system when it starts generating appeals that are getting rejected. That's a hybrid role that's genuinely hard to hire for. And at a 500-bed community hospital, you might not have that person on staff. So you're either building the capability from scratch or you're relying on the vendor's managed services, which cuts into your margin significantly.
And if you're relying on the vendor's managed services, you've now created a dependency that makes it very hard to switch vendors later.
Which is exactly how vendors want it. The switching cost is the moat. Once your appeal workflow is built around their system, your payer-specific tuning is in their platform, your staff is trained on their interface, Leaving is expensive. So the initial contract price is almost irrelevant compared to the total cost of the relationship over 5 years.
Okay, I want to bring in a specific example here because I think this conversation can get abstract fast. There's a scenario I've been thinking about. A regional health system, let's say a 500-bed community hospital, not an academic medical center, not a large IDN. They're seeing their Medicare Advantage denial rate climb. Let's say it's up 15 percentage points over 2 years. Their revenue cycle team is overwhelmed. A vendor comes in and pitches an AI-powered prior auth and appeal tool. What's the real decision tree here?
First question that leader needs to ask: what is your current appeal overturn rate? Because if your appeals are being overturned at a high rate, let's say 60, 70%, that tells you your denials are not clinically justified. They're automated and inappropriate. And in that case, the right first move is not to buy more automation. It's to document that pattern and take it to your state insurance commissioner or your congressional delegation, or both.
That's a regulatory play, not a technology play.
Exactly. And most health system leaders are not making that play because they don't think it'll work fast enough, which is rational in the short term and catastrophic in the long term.
Because if nobody makes the regulatory play,
The arms race continues. Vendors profit, payers profit from the denials that stick, providers spend more on administration, and patients wait longer. That's the equilibrium if nobody intervenes.
wait, you said payers profit from denials that stick, but they're also spending on their own automation infrastructure. At some point, that's a cost center too.
It is, but compare the cost of an AI denial engine against the revenue retained from denied claims that aren't appealed. For a large Medicare Advantage plan, that math is still very favorable. The automation cost is a fraction of the retained revenue.
And that's the fundamental asymmetry here. The payer's AI is directly tied to a revenue outcome. The provider's AI is defensive. It's trying to recover revenue that should never have been denied in the first place.
That's the market structure problem in one sentence. And I want to be direct. No amount of better tooling on the provider side changes that asymmetry. You can make the provider AI faster and smarter, and the payer will make their AI faster and smarter. And you're back where you started, except both sides have spent more money.
So is your argument that health systems should not invest in these tools at all?
No, my argument is that they should invest with clear eyes about what they're buying. They're buying a floor, not a ceiling. They're preventing their situation from getting worse, not making it fundamentally better. And they should simultaneously be pushing hard on the structural interventions, regulatory, legislative, contractual, because the technology investment alone will not solve this.
Let me push on that, though, because the regulatory timeline is long. CMS has been trying to tighten prior auth rules for years. The Improving Seniors Timely Access to Care Act. It passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support. It took years to get CMS rules finalized, and implementation has been uneven. So if you're a health system leader and you're told the regulatory fix is coming, what does that actually mean for your planning horizon?
It means don't bet your revenue cycle on it. Use it as a tailwind if it comes, not as a substitute for operational resilience. The CMS rules on electronic prior authorization are real, and they will reduce some friction. But they don't cap denial rates. They don't require clinical review timelines. They're process rules, not outcome rules.
That's an important distinction: process versus outcome regulation.
And the vendors selling prior auth AI are very comfortable with process regulation because it creates a market for their tools. Everyone needs to comply. Everyone needs automation to comply at scale. Outcome regulation: your denial overturn rate cannot exceed X%. That would actually change the incentive structure. And that conversation is barely happening.
I want to sit with that for a second because I think it's the sharpest thing you've said. Outcome-based authorization regulation rather than process-based. Why isn't that conversation happening? Is it a lobbying problem? A measurement problem?
Both. Measurement first. You can't regulate an outcome you can't reliably measure. And right now, the data on denial appropriateness is fragmented and largely controlled by payers. Lobbying second. Payers have invested heavily in making the case that utilization management is clinically necessary and that outcome-based caps would harm quality. That argument has enough surface plausibility that it slows the legislative conversation significantly.
Even though the overturn rate data, where it exists, suggests a lot of those denials weren't clinically justified in the first place.
Even though, and that's the information asymmetry problem again. The people making the argument that denials are clinically necessary are the same people controlling the data that would test that argument. That's not a coincidence.
It exists in fragments. Some state-level rules around gold carding, where providers with a strong track record get expedited authorization. Those are moving in the right direction. But they're patchwork, and payers have found ways to narrow their application.
Right. Gold carding sounds great until you look at how the eligibility criteria get defined. And who defines them?
The payer defines them. So the payer gets to decide which providers are trusted enough to bypass the authorization process that the payer controls. That's not a structural fix. That's a permission system.
And it creates a new problem. Providers who don't qualify for gold carding face higher scrutiny, almost by implication. You've stratified the market in a way that advantages large, well-resourced health systems and disadvantages smaller independent practices, which has its own access implications.
That's a dynamic I hadn't fully thought through. The gold carding benefit accrues to the systems that already have the infrastructure to document their track record. The ones who most need relief from administrative burden are least likely to qualify.
Exactly. It's a well-intentioned policy that ends up reinforcing existing market power asymmetries, which is a pattern you see a lot in healthcare reform.
Okay, let's talk about what a health system leader should actually do on Monday. Not in 3 years, when the regulatory landscape might be different. Monday. What's the concrete decision set?
3 things. And stop me if I'm going too fast.
Go ahead.
First, measure your actual denial and appeal data with precision, not just denial rate, appeal rate, overturn rate, time to resolution, and cost per authorization episode. Most health systems I talk to don't have that data at a granular level. You can't make a sound investment decision without it.
And that data is often sitting in 3 different systems that don't talk to each other.
Which is its own problem. But you need it before you can evaluate any vendor pitch credibly.
What's the second one?
When you're evaluating automation tools, and you should be evaluating them, do not accept ROI projections based on the vendor's own case studies with their best performing clients. Require a pilot with your actual payer mix, your actual denial patterns, your actual EHR environment. The variance in outcomes across different health system contexts is enormous.
That should be obvious, but I've seen health systems skip that step under time pressure.
Everyone is under time pressure. That's how vendors sell. The third one is the one most leaders don't want to hear. Assign someone at the leadership level, not the revenue cycle director level, to actively engage the regulatory and legislative track. Not as a lobbying exercise, as a strategic information gathering exercise. What is your state doing on prior auth reform? What are your congressional representatives hearing from other health systems? What coalitions exist? Because if you're only playing the technology game, you're playing on the payer's home field.
I want to zoom out for a second and ask you something that I think is genuinely unresolved. If both sides keep deploying smarter AI, and they will, what does the equilibrium actually look like in 3 years? Because I've heard optimistic versions of this. Eventually, the systems learn each other well enough that the friction drops, approvals get faster, the arms race stabilizes. Is that plausible?
It's the vendor narrative. And I understand why they tell it. It's reassuring and it's good for sales. But think about what that equilibrium actually requires. It requires payers to voluntarily reduce their denial rates as the automation gets more efficient. Why would they do that? Their financial incentive is to maintain or increase the denial rate as long as the retained revenue exceeds the cost of administration. Smarter AI makes the administration cheaper, not the denials rarer.
So you're saying the optimistic equilibrium assumes a change in payer behavior that has no financial basis.
Show me the business model where a payer's AI getting smarter results in fewer inappropriate denials rather than more efficient inappropriate denials. I haven't seen it.
That's a hard thing to sit with because it means the technology trajectory and the patient outcome trajectory are pointing in opposite directions.
Unless the incentive structure changes. Which brings us back to the regulatory question. And I want to be clear, I'm not arguing that regulation is a magic fix either. Regulatory capture is real. Payers have significant lobbying power. But the current trajectory without intervention is not a stable or acceptable equilibrium from a patient access standpoint.
And there's a third possibility that I don't think we've named yet. What about the payers who are also providers? Your large integrated systems, your Kaisers, your Geisingers, they're running both sides of this equation internally. Does the arms race look different when the payer and the provider are the same organization?
It looks different, but it doesn't disappear. The internal version of this conflict is utilization management versus clinical operations. And those two functions have genuinely different incentives, even inside the same organization. The team is measured on cost containment. The clinical team is measured on outcomes and throughput. You still get friction. You still get denials. You still get appeals. They're just happening inside one org chart instead of across a contract. And in some ways, that's harder to fix because the conflict is less visible.
Because there's no external adversary to point at.
Right. The dysfunction is internal and political rather than external and contractual. And the patients in those systems aren't necessarily better served. They're just experiencing a different version of the same problem.
Let me flag something for our listeners here, because I want to be honest about the evidence base. A lot of what we're discussing, the specific impact of AI denial engines on patient outcomes, the precise cost of the arms race, the data is still early stage and fragmented. We have case studies, we have advocacy reports, we have some congressional testimony. We do not yet have large-scale, peer-reviewed outcome studies that definitively quantify the harm. That matters for how health system leaders should weight this.
That's fair. And I'd add that part of why the data is fragmented is that payers are not required to disclose their denial algorithms or their denial rates at a granular level. So the information asymmetry in the research environment mirrors the information asymmetry in the market. We know less than we should, in part because the party with the most information has no incentive to share it.
That's a research gap and a regulatory gap at the same time. And I'd push back on one thing. The absence of peer-reviewed data doesn't mean the harm isn't real. It means we're making decisions in conditions of genuine uncertainty, which is actually the normal condition for health system leadership, but it's worth naming explicitly.
Agreed. And I'd say the uncertainty cuts both ways. We don't have definitive proof of the scale of harm, but we also don't have evidence that the arms race is producing better patient outcomes. The burden of proof shouldn't only run in one direction.
That's a fair point, but I want to be careful not to let it become an argument for inaction. We don't have proof it's harmful is not the same as it's fine.
No, it's not. And I'm not making that argument. I'm saying act, but act with appropriate humility about what the data can and can't tell you right now. The early evidence suggests real harm. The structural logic suggests it will get worse. That's enough to justify urgency. It's not enough to justify certainty about every specific claim.
Okay, what are you watching over the next 12 to 18 months? What are the 2 or 3 signals that would tell you this dynamic is shifting in either direction?
First signal, Medicare Advantage denial rate data. CMS is collecting more of it. If we see published data showing that AI-driven denial rates in Medicare Advantage are materially higher than clinically justified denial rates, and early indications suggest we will, that becomes a political and regulatory accelerant. Watch for that data to surface and watch for how payers respond to it publicly.
And if they respond by tightening their clinical review criteria documentation rather than actually reducing inappropriate denials,
That's the tell. Playing defense on optics rather than on substance.
what's the second signal?
Watch the digital health funding landscape. MedCity News reported last week that digital health raised $7.4 billion in the first half of 2026. And the notable shift is that investors are moving toward domain expertise rather than pure technology plays. If you start seeing significant capital flowing into companies that build outcome accountability tools, not just faster authorization bots, but tools that actually track and report on authorization outcomes, that's a sign the market is starting to price in regulatory risk.
That's a subtle signal, but it's a real one. The investment thesis tells you where sophisticated money thinks the risk is.
And right now, a lot of that capital is still going into the automation tools themselves, both sides of the arms race. When it starts flowing toward accountability infrastructure, that's when the market is pricing in a structural shift.
And the third signal?
State-level action. Federal prior auth reform moves slowly. But states like California, Texas, and New York are moving on prior auth legislation at a pace that is faster than the federal track. If you see 2 or 3 large states pass outcome-based prior auth rules, not just process rules, in the next 18 months, that changes the calculus for national payers significantly because they can't run 50 different denial algorithms. At some point, the most restrictive state rule becomes the de facto national standard.
That's happened before in healthcare regulation, California especially.
It has, and payers know it, which is part of why they're lobbying aggressively at the state level right now. Watch where the lobbying money is going. That tells you where they're worried.
And I'd add a fourth signal that I'm watching. What happens with the large language model integration on the appeal side? Because right now, appeal generation is largely templated. What happens when providers have access to genuinely generative, context-aware appeal tools that can pull from the clinical record and construct a customized argument in real time? Does that change the overturn rate meaningfully? And if it does, how fast do payers adapt their denial criteria in response?
That's the next frontier, and I'd be cautious about the optimistic version of it. Generative appeal tools will raise the floor on appeal quality. Fewer poorly documented appeals, fewer appeals that get rejected on technicalities. But payers will respond by raising the bar on what constitutes a sufficient clinical argument. The criteria will get more complex, not less. So you get better appeals meeting a higher bar, and the net change in overturn rates may be smaller than the technology optimists expect.
Which is the arms race dynamic again, just one level up.
Always. The technology changes, the structure doesn't, until the structure changes.
Natalie, I want to ask you one question that I think is genuinely open, and I don't want a clean answer because I don't think one exists. Is there any version of this where AI actually helps? Not helps the payer, not helps the provider win the authorization fight, actually helps the patient get faster access to appropriate care.
Yes, but it requires a different deployment model than what's happening now. The version that helps patients is one where AI is used to predict authorization likelihood at the point of ordering, before the request goes in, so that clinicians can either document more thoroughly upfront
or choose an alternative pathway that doesn't require authorization. That's a clinical decision support function, not a denial engine or an appeal engine. And it exists. There are tools doing this, but it's a small fraction of the market right now because the market incentives are pointing toward the arms race, not toward upstream clinical optimization.
And for that model to scale, you'd need payers to share their criteria transparently enough that providers can actually predict authorization likelihood at the point of order.
Which payers have a financial disincentive to do because transparent criteria mean fewer denials based on documentation gaps. So even the version of AI that could genuinely help patients is being structurally suppressed by the same incentive misalignment we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes.
That is the open question I want to leave listeners with, not a rhetorical one, a real one. If the version of AI that helps patients requires payer transparency that payers are financially motivated to withhold, what actually changes that? Regulation? Market pressure? Something else? I don't think either of us has a clean answer to that.
I don't, and I'd be skeptical of anyone who claims they do. What I'd say is the answer probably involves all three: regulatory pressure that creates a floor, market pressure from employers and large purchasers who are tired of paying for the arms race, and technology that makes transparency less costly for payers to provide. But those three things have to move together, and right now, they're moving independently and slowly. That's the honest assessment.
And I'd add, the fourth ingredient is health system leaders who are willing to make the regulatory play, not just the technology play. Because if every health system responds to this by buying a better appeal bot and nobody takes the data to the state insurance commissioner, the incentive to change the structure never materializes.
That's right. And it's a collective action problem. Each individual health system is rational to buy the bot. The collective result of everyone buying the bot is that the structure stays broken. That's not a technology problem. That's a leadership problem.
Which is maybe the hardest thing to say to a room full of health system leaders who are already overwhelmed. The thing you need to do is the thing that won't pay off for 3 years and requires you to coordinate with your competitors. That's a tough sell.
It is. And I don't have a good answer for how to make it easier. I just think it's the honest description of what's required.
Let me bring this home. Natalie, if you had 60 seconds with a health system CEO who is about to sign a contract for a prior auth AI tool, what do you say?
Before you sign, answer 3 questions. 1. What is your current appeal overturn rate? And does it tell you your denials are inappropriate rather than clinically justified? 2. Have you stress tested this vendor's ROI model against your specific payer mix, not their reference accounts? And 3. What is your organization's plan for the regulatory and legislative track? Because the technology investment alone will not get you out of this arms race. If you can't answer all 3, slow down.
And I'd add one clinical lens question. Does this tool help clinicians make better ordering decisions upstream, or does it only fight the fight after the denial has already happened? Because those are very different investments with very different clinical and financial profiles.
That's the right question. And most tools being sold right now are the second type, not the first. Which doesn't mean you shouldn't buy them. It means you should know what you're buying.
Natalie, I want to push back on one thing before we close, because I think I've let you off the hook on it. You've been pretty critical of the technology investment throughout this conversation, but you haven't said what the alternative is for a health system that is watching its denial rate climb right now, today, and cannot wait for regulatory reform. What do they actually do?
They buy the tool. I want to be clear about that. I'm not arguing for inaction. The alternative to buying a counter-denial tool in the current environment is watching your revenue erode while you wait for a structural fix that may be years away. That's not a viable strategy. What I'm arguing is that they buy the tool and simultaneously make the regulatory play. Not one or the other. Both. The tool buys you time. The regulatory play changes the game. You need both.
And if they can only do one?
Buy the tool. Survive first. But don't mistake surviving for winning.
That's actually the most useful thing you've said. Survive first. Don't mistake surviving for winning.
I've been trying to get there for 40 minutes.
Natalie Janssen, this has been one of the most clear-eyed conversations I've had on this show about where the real structural problems in health system AI are sitting. Thank you for pushing back where you pushed back, and for not letting me reach for the optimistic frame without earning it.
These conversations matter. I hope it's useful to people actually sitting in those rooms.
Let me wrap this up for our listeners. Here's what I think you should carry out of this episode. The bot versus bot dynamic in prior authorization is real, it is accelerating, and it is costing the healthcare system and patients in ways that are not yet fully visible in the data, but are very visible on the ground. The core tension that Natalie named, and that I don't think we resolved because it can't be resolved with technology alone, is this. Payer AI and provider AI are both being deployed rationally by organizations following their financial incentives in a system where those incentives are structurally opposed. Faster, smarter AI on both sides does not produce a better outcome for patients. It produces a more efficient conflict. The Monday actions are real and they are urgent. Measure your actual authorization data at a granular level. Evaluate any vendor tool against your specific environment, not their best case reference accounts. Assign leadership-level attention to the regulatory and legislative track, not as an afterthought, but as a parallel strategic investment. And hold on to the open question we ended with. What actually creates the transparency that would let AI serve patients rather than serve the arms race? That question does not have a clean answer today. But the leaders who are asking it now will be better positioned when the answer starts to emerge. Now, before I sign off, I want to ask something directly of you, the person listening right now. If this episode resonated with you, please subscribe to Agents of Health wherever you get your podcasts. We put out episodes like this every week, and if you're a healthcare leader trying to separate signal from noise in health technology, I think you'll find it worth your time. If this episode was useful, hit like. It genuinely helps other people in healthcare find the show. And if you know a CFO, a CIO, a CMO, or a revenue cycle leader who is right now sitting across the table from a prior auth AI vendor and trying to figure out what questions to ask, send them this episode. That's exactly who we made it for. And here's what I really mean. Leave a comment. Tell me where you think Natalie and I got it right and where you think we got it wrong. Tell me what your health system is actually seeing on denial rates and appeal cycles. Tell me if you've found an AI tool that is genuinely helping upstream rather than just fighting the fight downstream. Because I want to know, and I want to feature those real-world experiences in future episodes. I read every comment. The best questions from listeners become the agenda for future shows. This conversation is not over, it's just starting. Thanks for listening to Agents of Health.